International Center for Scholars. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Directors Forum with Dr. Michael Leigh, Director General for Enlargement at the European Commission. The Woodrow Wilson Center serves as this nation's official and living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. To honor this man of ideas, the nation's only president to hold a PhD, the United States Congress 41 years ago memorialized the 28th president by creating this institution of advanced research. The Wilson Center is a public-private institution, receiving roughly 1/3 of its budget from a congressional appropriation and raising 2/3 of its budget from grants and foundations. Here at the Wilson Center, we bridge the worlds of scholarship and policy by bringing together the thinkers and the doers, academics, policymakers, journalists, business people, scientists, in a robust dialogue on the key issues of the day. It is my privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Michael Leigh. EU enlargement has been celebrated as the European Union's most successful foreign policy. And Dr. Leigh has been at the forefront of that policy for more than a decade. Following the Wilsonian tradition, Dr. Leigh began his career in academia, earning a BA at Oxford University and a PhD in political science from MIT. He has published and lectured on European integration, foreign policy, and international relations at Wellesley College, the University of Sussex, and Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Leigh joined the European Commission in the late 1970s. In his long career with the Commission, he has worked in various directorates, including external relations, fisheries, and information. In 1998, after serving for 5 years in the cabinet of Commissioner Hans van den Broek, Leigh was the lead negotiator for the accession talks with the Czech Republic. In the year 2000, he became Director for Enlargement with regard to Turkey, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Malta, and Romania. In 2003, he shifted to the Director General for External Relations, where he served as Deputy Director General responsible for the European Neighborhood Policy, relations with Eastern Europe, the Southern Caucasus and Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Southern Mediterranean. He has served as Director General for Enlargement since the year 2006 and oversaw the accession of Romania and Bulgaria in 2007. The most recent enlargement has created a union of 27 member states. Today, the European Union is a community of over 500 million people and is the world's largest economy and is a world leader in trade and regulation. The enlargement policy has given the European Union a remarkable reach in terms of exporting its norms and democratic values outside of its borders. Most notably, the EU has done this without military might, weapons of intimidation, but through shared purpose that unites the European continent in freedom, prosperity, security, and solidarity. Dr. Leigh, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Thank you very much for that, for the invitation to be here with you this morning, and for that very kind introduction. I feel to some extent you've said it all, at least in terms of the advantages of the enlargement policy. You've certainly made my job a lot easier. What I'd like to do this morning is to discuss with you some of the main challenges on the EU's enlargement agenda today and the way in which we propose to tackle it. On the 14th of October, the Commission will publish its annual progress reports on each of the candidate and potential candidate countries and issue a strategy document indicating the main priorities and the way ahead for the coming year. And while I don't want to anticipate on the political debate in the European Commission, which will finalize these documents, I would like to share with you some of the main issues that we've been considering in the run-up to this important event. Before doing so, though, I would like to back up just a little bit and recall the remarkable success as you kindly mentioned in your introduction, of the enlargement process until now. In 2004, 10 new countries joined the European Union, 8 in Central and Eastern Europe, Malta and Cyprus, and in 2007, Bulgaria and Romania. And when one looks back on the last 15 years or so, the transformation process in Central and Eastern Europe has been far smoother than one would have predicted in advance. And I think the umbrella provided by the European Union for the process of transition to a market economy and democracy provided tremendous incentives and support. Certainly in some cases there have been challenges, and now with the economic and financial crisis, it's true that some of the economies of the new member states face particular difficulties. But in a way, at this stage of the transition process, that was only to be expected. In general, I think the fact that half the European continent has been transformed in peaceful conditions is a great tribute, first and foremost, to the peoples and their leaders in the countries concerned, but also to the umbrella provided by the European Union. The 2004-2007 enlargement was on such a scale that one might feel that the process was essentially completed. But this is not the case, as we still have an active enlargement agenda, and beyond the present agenda, other countries a little further afield that have expressed a distinct interest in joining the European Union. To recall briefly, the current enlargement agenda covers the countries of the Western Balkans, that is to say, the countries that formed part of Yugoslavia, as well as Albania and Turkey. These are the countries which, as we say in Brussels, have been given the perspective of one day joining the European Union. There's often speculation as to how far this process might ultimately go. And to be sure, there are other countries to the east of the enlarged EU that have expressed an interest in joining this process. But we're still engaged in digesting the last enlargement. We're going through an economic and financial crisis. Our institutions are being reformed through the Lisbon Treaty, which we trust will be shortly ratified after the referendum in Ireland on the 2nd of October, and we trust the remaining ratifications from Poland and the Czech Republic. So this is a period of consolidation. The current enlargement agenda, therefore, comprises the countries that I've mentioned to you, and clearly they are not without challenges. Some of the main challenges to which we draw attention in our forthcoming report are, first and foremost, those posed by the economic and financial crisis. This is something that has affected the EU, like the United States, very deeply, and our partners in the Balkans and Turkey have to different degrees also faced major difficulties. We're working together with the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, in Europe, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to alleviate as best we can the impact of this crisis in countries already engaged in the challenges of transition. And their economies are already so interdependent with ours that it's clearly in our mutual interest to work together on this. Other issues which are prominent this year are regional integration. In the immediate aftermath of the dreadful wars that marked the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, the international community came in to create a framework for regional cooperation amongst the countries concerned, mainly through the Stability Pact. This has been phased out now, and instead we have locally owned institutions for regional cooperation which have just got off the ground in the last year. We want to see these thriving and really delivering results in areas like trade, energy, transport, and other fields. And we're providing support to the countries concerned to make a reality of this process. It does face difficulties, not least the difficulty resulting from the status of Kosovo and the very different positions of countries in the region with that regard. Several have recognized Kosovo, as have 22 of our member states. Others, of course, beginning with Serbia, have not. 5 of our member states have not recognized Serbia. And so finding compromises when it comes to participation in regional cooperation organizations is one of the difficulties that we face. Other issues which are important in giving a real sense to the population that European integration means something to them, and that even if they will have to wait some time before joining the European Union, there are benefits along the way which reflect reforms that have been undertaken, is the whole field of people-to-people contacts and free movement of people. And this year, there have been quite a few impressive breakthroughs, despite the sensitivity of all issues related to migration. We have reached an agreement to abolish visa requirements for Serbia, for Montenegro, and for the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And we've said that if they meet the necessary benchmarks, we hope we can take the same step vis-à-vis Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania next year. I think we cannot underestimate the significance of this development. When you take Serbia, for example, you find 60 or 70% of young people never having left the country at all. How can they play their role as young Europeans? How can they be part of the further construction of Europe in the years ahead if they've not had opportunities to interact with their counterparts in other European countries? Given the sensitivity of all matters related to migration, I think this is a very courageous move on the part of the European Union, and it's one that the populations will feel the real benefit of rather rapidly. We hope we can go ahead with other countries in the region as quickly as possible. One difficulty that we face at this stage in the enlargement process is the continued prevalence of bilateral issues between the countries concerned in this region. Obviously, in the case of countries of the former Yugoslavia, there are many issues related to reconciliation, looked at positively, conflicts on issues such as minorities and border delimitation, which cast a little bit of a shadow over the enlargement process in the region. And there, in our policy documents this year, we are developing concepts as to how we can overcome some of these difficulties. For example, in the case of the differences between Croatia, which is involved in accession negotiations with the European Union, and is quite well advanced in that process, and Slovenia, there have, as you know, been serious differences over border demarcation. And the European Commission provided its good offices to facilitate a solution to this difficulty. And now there's every sign that the 2 prime ministers have reached an understanding, and we hope that quite soon this difficulty will be behind us. It took some time. The accession negotiations have been delayed to some degree, but we hope all that is now behind us. But there are other potential issues of this nature throughout the region. And this year we'll be very much appealing to the countries concerned that they should draw a clear distinction between bilateral conflicts, which they need to overcome through their own efforts, possibly with our assistance through facilitation, and the EU accession process, which is not really about bilateral issues. We've insisted very much on the principle that the pace whereby a country approaches membership in the European Union is largely determined by the pace of its reforms, its political and economic reforms. And the credibility of this approach can clearly be challenged if bilateral matters intrude to slow down the process, which otherwise might go ahead more rapidly. There are a number of remaining issues in the region, and we hope very much that in the year ahead we can overcome them. Another major theme this year concerns Kosovo, because obviously the situation in Kosovo after the declaration of independence and the adoption of a constitution is one of concern to all countries in the region and to the European Union. All things considered, this has been a surprisingly smooth process, given the background of the wars of the late 90s, given the difference in the point of view of countries in the region and different member states. There has been a remarkable degree of stability within Kosovo itself, and many of the measures that people feared might have been taken following the declaration of independence that could have exacerbated the situation were not taken. And once again, I think the European umbrella explains some of that. But clearly there's no ground for complacency. And this year we will be issuing a study, a so-called feasibility study, on ways in which Kosovo too can draw closer to the European Union in the framework of our broad policy for the region. And we explore a number of areas ranging from trade to free movement of individuals, participation in EU agencies and regulatory bodies, whereby we can encourage economic development and further stability in Kosovo, hoping that the conditions will be achieved which enable us to overcome the present differences of view as to recognition and Kosovo's status. So this year we renew our commitment to the enlargement process based on what Commissioner Rehn a few years ago put forward as a policy based on 3 C's. The first C being that the EU keeps its commitments to the countries to whom we've given an enlargement perspective. There's no stepping back from that. But that this commitment is based on firm conditionality, and the fulfillment of clear and explicit benchmarks is the way to come closer to the European Union. And this carefully managed process means that each country is very clear about the steps it needs to take if it wishes to move closer to the European Union. And the third C, which is extremely important, is the question of communications with the public. I think it's quite clear in retrospect that the 5th enlargement took place in the absence of a complete understanding on the part of public opinion in the existing European Union as to the issues at stake. I think our political leaders did not adequately explain to public opinion why the EU was engaged in the enlargement process, what European interests were at stake, what the benefits would be in terms of stability, security, prosperity. And as a result, the public was somewhat perplexed. And while this was not a decisive issue, it clearly was one of the issues that played into the referendum votes, first of all in France and the Netherlands on the constitutional treaty, and later in Ireland on the present Lisbon Treaty. So I think it's in all of our interests that a major effort should be made to broader understanding through better communications with the public on this question. I think rather than run through the issues country by country with you now in my introductory remarks, I would be happy to discuss with you specific situations that may be of interest in a question and answer session. We provide detailed reports on the progress made by our 3 candidate countries, our existing candidate countries, Turkey, which is involved in accession negotiations with the EU since 2005, Croatia, similarly, and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which has been recognized as a candidate country, but that has not yet fulfilled all the benchmarks needed to start the accession negotiations. We also cover in our report the countries that have applied for membership. In the course of the last year, we have received applications from Montenegro, from Albania, and most recently from Iceland. For 2 of these applications, Montenegro and Iceland, our member states have started the process requesting the European Commission to prepare opinions, formal opinions, on the applications for membership, and we expect that the Council will shortly ask us also to provide a formal opinion on Albania's application for membership. I think these applications demonstrate the continued magnetic attraction of the EU for countries in Europe. The EU is, under the treaty, open for memberships, applications for membership from all European countries that share its values. And we will treat these applications with the same seriousness of purpose and the same objectivity that we have in the case of all previous accessions. Iceland obviously poses particular and rather different challenges. During my stay in Washington, I've had meetings with the IMF and others that are looking into the situation after the severe economic difficulties faced by Iceland. And I think it's very important for them to continue their discussions with the UK and the Netherlands in particular concerning outstanding difficulties on the IceSave question. It's very important for them also to move ahead with the IMF so that they can begin to see a strategy of exit from the present crisis. That will be going ahead in parallel with their application for membership. We've issued a detailed questionnaire for Iceland. It's already part of the European Economic Area, which covers perhaps 2/3 of the laws and rules of the European Union. So it's quite well prepared to assume the obligations of membership in the future. This gives a somewhat different appearance to the enlargement dossier that has been so much focused on transition countries and Turkey. But we see that in Northern Europe too, perhaps for different reasons, the prospects of EU membership still exercise a powerful attraction. Another very important issue this year in the broad framework of enlargement is the ongoing efforts under the UN auspices to find a solution to the Cyprus problem. As you will recall, the Republic of Cyprus joined the European Union in 2004. The whole of Cyprus, as such, is a member of the European Union, but the application of our laws and rules, the so-called acquis, has been suspended in the northern part of the island. We are encouraged that the leaders of the two communities on the island have engaged in serious talks in the UN framework. We have offered to provide support, particularly in the form of technical and legal advice as to the compatibility of what they might agree with obligations arising under the EU treaties. And we hope very much that in the months ahead they will reach a satisfactory outcome. This will be extremely positive in itself, and it will also be a factor that will no doubt affect the prospects of further progress in the accession negotiations with Turkey, where several of the negotiating chapters have been effectively set aside because Turkey until now has not met an obligation arising from its customs union agreement with the EU to extend this fully to all member states of the EU, including the Republic of Cyprus. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been an issue as to the access of vessels from all member states, including the Republic of Cyprus, to Turkish ports. And as long as this issue is not resolved, there is a certain shadow over the accession negotiations. So we hope very much that progress in the months ahead will remove this shadow and that it will be possible to move ahead with further progress. This is not an exhaustive list of the issues, but I wanted to give you some of the flavor of the challenges that we're facing this year. And I'd be happy to discuss these or other issues with you in greater detail in the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leigh, and the floor will be open for questions. We have Elizabeth on the side with a microphone, and raise your hand. The lady here in the black and white.
Thank you very much. Kıvılcım Kılıç from the Turkish Embassy. Thank you very much for your presentation, and it was very comprehensive and stimulating indeed. Well, as for Turkey's relations with the EU, you've mentioned in your presentation, well, I don't want to go into details because it's not a new kind of relationship. It is a relationship of almost 50 years of history. And it is part and parcel of Turkey's overall modernization and westernization policy dating back to the 18th century. So we know the history, we know all the stages. But what I would like to point out here today is that when you look at today's Turkey, and what today's Turkey is doing, both internally with all the democratic reforms and openings, and externally in its foreign relations, you see that Turkey is a country which stands for stability and peace in its region and beyond, and is trying to pursue a foreign policy which is devoid of problems with its neighbors. It is called zero problems with neighbors policy, trying to forge cooperations and alliances among the countries in its region, and last but not least, trying to seek a benign regional order as a peace provider, as a facilitator, problem solver, etc. So I think you would agree with me that such a Turkey would be a real asset for the EU, not a burden. This is my first point. My second point is on Cyprus. In fact, I wouldn't wish to touch upon this issue, but since you've mentioned in your presentation, let me spare a few words on it. Well, Cyprus. First of all, speaking of the commitments and the additional protocol or the commitments upon Turkey, always reminds me something. That is that, first of all, Cyprus issue belongs to the UN agenda, not to the EU agenda. But EU, by having taken the Greek Cypriots on board as a member, as you've said, in 2004, has imported this issue into itself and has created, unfortunately, a de facto link between the Cyprus issue and the EU, and has made itself involved in this issue. So if it is the case, I remember that there are some commitments on the part of the EU towards Turkish Cypriots, for example, on the direct trade. I remember that there was a direct trade regulation with the Turkish Cypriots, and this regulation was approved by the Council in April 2004. And this was not a joke, it was a firm and solid commitment on the part of the EU. But strangely enough, and people tend to forget about this commitment, but the same people, if I may say so, who seem to have forgotten about this commitment, spare no efforts to bring up this additional protocol issue over and again and put it in front of Turkey as a commitment. This is all the more striking. Well, I'll come to my question. My question is different, in fact. Yeah. It is, this is my second, I told you, I wouldn't wish to touch upon this issue, but since you've mentioned it. Yes, I did it now. My question is rather general. It is Turkey's relations with the EU and the transatlantic agenda. You see that this issue is still one of the divergences between the transatlantic partners. Whereas the United States is one of the staunchest supporters of Turkey being a European Union member, but in Europe we see that, public is very much confused about all kinds of debates, all kinds of negative statements of some of the leaders about Turkey's European vocation, Turkey's European identity, etc. So my question is, what could be done to have the transatlantic partners develop a much more pragmatic, or rather the European partner, develop a much more pragmatic approach towards Turkey when it comes to its relations with the EU, by especially in taking into consideration Turkey's very active and very constructive foreign policy role in international politics. Thank you. Sorry about that. I was a bit long.
It was long. I don't know if you want to make a comment on the question or on our two comments for a minute. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Let me respond to those different points. First of all, I agree entirely that Turkey's relationship with the EU and its accession process is very much in the interests of both sides. And in our previous reports and this year as well, we will be reminding the public, the readers of our reports, what some of those interests are. And I think today, above all, Turkey plays an extremely important role in issues related to its own region and the prevention or the overcoming of regional conflict. Turkey plays a very important role in issues related to energy which are at the top of the EU's agenda today, particularly the diversification of energy sources. And there, for example, we are extremely encouraged at the recent signature of the Intergovernmental Agreement to launch the Nabucco project, where the Commission played quite a role as well in getting to this point. And also, I think, Turkey's role in the dialogue between civilizations and the prevention of polarization around civilization issues is also very important. So I think it's very timely, and in your remarks, I think it's very, very appropriate to remind everybody of the importance of the broad geopolitical interests which are at stake in this relationship. As to Cyprus, again, I entirely agree that a resolution of the Cyprus problem is under the auspices of the United Nations and not of the European Union. We're encouraged at the fact that a new process is underway. The leaders of the two communities seem to be very serious in their engagement. I think they're reaching the stage of a give and take on the different issues, and we hope that with Turkey's continued support for this process, as well as that of Greece, we will be able to see the two parties reaching agreement in the not-too-distant future. I think this will make a tremendous difference for the region as a whole, for Europe, for Turkey, for all who have a stake in this question. I think we have to hope very much that they will succeed in this process. As to the different commitments to which you referred, the commitment concerning the additional protocol to the Customs Union Agreement, in the EU view, is one that derives from the start of accession negotiations in 2005, was part of the negotiating guidelines, independently of any other issue. It was something that Turkey was aware of at that stage. As far as Cyprus is concerned, following the previous negotiations in the UN framework, which led to the so-called Annan Plan that was approved in a referendum in the northern part of the island and that was voted against in the referendum in the southern part of the island, the EU indicated that it was ready to take steps to end the isolation of the Turkish Cypriot community. And we proposed three measures. We proposed first a very far-reaching aid program of 259 million euros. This is something that we had never done before in the north. On a per capita basis, this is the most intensive, aid-intensive project that was supporting anywhere in the world. And for the last 3 years, we've been implementing this support, and I think the Turkish Cypriots themselves appreciate this very much. It has led to a high degree of interaction between the Turkish Cypriots and the European Union. It includes, for example, a major new scholarship program for Turkish Cypriots to come and study in the European Union, infrastructure projects, projects related to administrative capacity, and explaining to the Turkish Cypriots the implications of EU rules and laws and what it would mean following a settlement for the suspension of the acquis to be lifted and for EU law to be applied throughout the island. The second measure we proposed as a way of ending the isolation of the Turkish Cypriot community is the so-called Green Line regulation, which has permitted trade between the two parts of the island. This was adopted and has been implemented over the last few years. The third was the one to which you referred, that would have permitted direct trade between the northern part of the island and the EU, and as you rightly say, this has not yet been adopted. It remains on the table. The Commission has given it its full support. The proposal has not been withdrawn, and we hope it will be adopted. As a practical matter, it's clear now that the main action is focused on the UN talks, and I think we have to see, above all, that these will succeed. I agree that in terms of public opinion, it's important. You mentioned the transatlantic context, both in the United States and in the European Union and in Turkey itself, that people understand more clearly the issues involved. And it's perfectly clear that there are different currents of public opinion on this issue in the European Union and in Turkey itself. There are those in Turkey who are discouraged, who no longer support the EU accession process. There are others who believe firmly that the country's destiny is linked with this process and give it full encouragement. In the European Union, too, there are different currents of opinion in different member states, in different segments of the population. And Turkey has certainly been discouraged by the fact that some senior political leaders have expressed their own doubts as to whether Turkey's final destiny is as a member of the European Union or not. I think it's normal and healthy in democratic societies that there should be such differences. The important thing is to look at how the parties actually behave towards each other, notwithstanding the different currents of public opinion. And if you look, for example, at the EU accession negotiations, I think you can see that notwithstanding these doubts and hesitations on both sides, notwithstanding, as you mentioned, the problem of Cyprus and other such issues, we have remained firmly committed to this process, and we have managed to go ahead, regrettably, at a slow pace. Until now, 11 out of 35 negotiating chapters have been opened. We have made strenuous efforts to open further chapters under each presidency with great difficulty. In the first half of the year, for example, we eventually managed to open the chapter on taxation, but this was only after a very late commitment by Turkey to adopt the necessary legislation and to eliminate what we saw as discriminatory taxation on imports and domestically produced alcohol, tobacco, and so on, all kinds of technical issues. We're hoping under the Swedish presidency to open further chapters too, but there it also depends on delivery in terms of the benchmarks that have been set. And I know that the Turkish administration is working hard on this, that the European Integration Department in Turkey has recently been beefed up, and we hope very much that we can make further progress. So in response to your question there, I would say yes, indeed, there are different views on this matter. Those of us who are committed to the process should use all occasions to explain what is at stake, but perhaps we should focus more on what the EU as such and Turkey as such, as partners, are able to achieve, rather than the fluctuations of public opinion on both sides.
Thank you for that. We have the lady in back in the maroon blouse, and then the woman in orange, and then Dr. Wiarda.
Elizabeth Pond, journalist and author in Berlin. I was a little surprised to hear you say that only 70% or two-thirds of the EU rules and regulations apply within the European economic space. I would have thought it would be more like 90%. And out of curiosity, just what is excluded, formally or informally? And second, what process and timing do you foresee for Kosovo's application for membership?
Well, we have, in our accession negotiations, divided up the acquis into some 35 chapters. Of that, about 31 are substantive, the others are procedural. And we think that the European Economic Area covers something like two-thirds of these areas. And Iceland, for example, has already been at work implementing the acquis in these two-thirds that I referred to. There are a number of important areas that are not covered, including, for example, agriculture, fisheries, and quite a lot of environmental legislation, as well as the new acquis of the European Union in common foreign security policy, European defense security policy. And in some of these areas, we can expect major challenges. Obviously, fisheries is of decisive importance in the case of Iceland. Mentioned in the introduction, this was a field that I worked in a few years ago, and we can see that there are major challenges there. Agriculture, there are similar issues to those faced by Finland and Sweden during their accession process, issues related to northern agriculture in the particular climatic conditions of Iceland. There are environmental issues. There are a range of matters because the acquis has constantly developed in fields going beyond the EEA. But that being said, it means that the scope of the negotiations with a country such as Iceland would be narrower than that with another, because we can assume that to a very large degree in this area these obligations have been already covered. Sorry, I forgot the second part of the question. In terms of Kosovo, we have mapped out for the countries of the Western Balkans a clear path towards membership, which is in a way similar to the path followed by the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in the fifth enlargement. The first stage in this is the conclusion of an association agreement. the implementation of that association agreement, the establishment of a track record that shows that the country has the administrative capacity to take on all the rights and obligations of membership, and progressing through that towards the situation, as in the case of Montenegro, say, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, where an application for membership becomes feasible, and then the whole machinery related to that application can come into effect. In the case of Kosovo, Kosovo is not recognized by all our member states, which means that the establishment of the same kind of contractual links we have with other countries in the region is not yet possible. So what we've been doing in the case of Kosovo is to pursue a kind of parallel process where we establish priorities for reforms, where we provide grant aid and credits from the European Investment Bank, for example, to support the transition process there. Many of the same issues are relevant: fight against organized crime and corruption, putting into place efficient taxation, customs authorities, the whole panoply of what is required of a modern state aspiring towards eventual membership in the European Union. We also are pursuing a parallel process with Kosovo. We have monitoring of progress made, and in our progress reports, for example, we'll be reminding the Kosovars of the areas where they need to make further efforts. And we have one or two new suggestions in our feasibility study. But as long as the issue of status is not finally resolved, there are certain constraints on this process. Therefore, and also considering Kosovo's level of economic development and the fact that it still very much needs to consolidate its institutions and to have the various institutions of the state working smoothly, obviously this is a project for the medium term.
Thank you. The lady in orange, and then Dr. Wiarda.
My name is Julia Volkovska. I work for Voice of America Macedonian Service, and even though this is a bilateral matter, I would appreciate if you can be more specific regarding Macedonia's prospects for EU integration, having in mind the name dispute between Macedonia and Greece. And obviously the visa liberalization was a big step forward. So if you can please comment on that. Thank you.
I think that the country has made a lot of progress in the last year. One of the features in the enlargement process is that we're very clear as to the benchmarks that need to be met for a country to advance. And we set 8 key priority areas that needed to be addressed. And I'm confident that in our report this year we will be able to report on substantial achievements in meeting these key priorities. So I think there has been a lot of progress: judicial reform, administrative reform, a much better dialogue between the different political actors within the country. The last elections in the country were largely in line with the international norms and the norms prevailing in the European Union. That had not been the case for the last 2 general elections, for example. So I think we will be able to report on very considerable progress. The other issue that you mentioned is obviously one that weighs on this process: the disagreement that there is between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia concerning the name question. There's been a process underway for some time designed to solve this problem, but it's still there on the table. To be realistic about things, I suppose that between now and the Greek elections on the 4th of October, we wouldn't expect any decisive steps to be taken. But my hope very much is that following those elections, both sides will re-engage in the process and that we should see a solution to this matter. We've always made clear that good neighbourly relations are a key feature of EU membership. And we hope, just as we've seen other long-lasting disputes, such as the one I mentioned between Slovenia and Croatia, put behind us, we hope that this issue we can put behind us too very soon.
I'm Howard Wiarda from here at the Wilson Center and author of an earlier book on EU enlargement. Could you talk a little bit, both as an administrator and from your earlier political science background, colleague, about the interrelations between EU enlargement and NATO enlargement. Often in the past, these have gone on parallel tracks, and sometimes they converge, and sometimes they diverge, and sometimes there's a train wreck somewhere along the line. Could you talk about that a little bit? For example, is there a NATO representative in your office, and are there legal and structural accords that define the relations between the two? Or do you meet regularly with NATO officials or not? And is there discussion of who should go first? In other words, should countries join NATO first, which therefore helps prepare them and modernize them for EU membership, or should the EU membership go first, which helps prepare them for NATO membership? There's often a little after you, Alphonse, dance that goes on between the EU and NATO. Could you talk as much as you're able to do, a little bit informally about some of these relations, both the structural relations and, from your point of view, the political relations between the two?
Yes, by all means. Obviously, NATO and the European Union are very different bodies. The European Union is essentially a governmental body which can adopt laws that have immediate force in the member states, that covers a very wide range of competences, stretching from foreign policy through to police and judicial cooperation, to all the technical issues related to the internal market, the four freedoms, and so on. So the acquis of the European Union is extremely broad. I think the term acquis is not that much used in the NATO context, but if one were to do so for the purposes of this morning's discussion, one can say that the acquis of NATO is considerably narrower. NATO is essentially a military alliance, albeit with certain principles and values which overlap to some degree with those concerning the European Union. When one looks at the NATO process, with membership action plans being offered to potential candidates for NATO membership, one can see, for example, that in the fields of governance, democracy, the rule of law, there is some similarity between the requirements of NATO and the requirements of the European Union. But the other conditions required by NATO are much more related to political issues, and they do not include the wide range of competences necessary to function effectively as a member of the European Union. So the two processes really are distinct. I think given the different nature of these acquis, it's not surprising that some countries have been deemed ready for membership in NATO on the basis of their fulfilling NATO benchmarks before they were able to fulfill the much wider range of requirements for EU membership. And, for example, most recently, we have seen Albania and Croatia joining NATO when they were still at an earlier stage in their preparations for EU membership. It may well have been at certain stages that this kind of two-step process de facto has given encouragement to countries where the light at the end of the tunnel on the EU track was still more distant, but by acceding to NATO, they felt that they were already becoming part of what they like to call Euro-Atlantic institutions. This is a terminology almost entirely limited to the candidates. You never really hear this terminology used on the part of NATO or EU members. But clearly for some of them, they did perceive earlier membership in NATO as a first important step, which demonstrated to their publics that they were on the path to full integration within this Euro-Atlantic family. And it was a useful first step along the way towards EU membership. No, there is not close consultation between NATO and the EU on such matters. There are informal contacts between officials in NATO and the EU, but this has not become a structural process for reasons that I'm sure you are aware of. And we hope very much in the future that NATO-EU cooperation could develop further. So these are two distinct processes, each with their own logic and each with their own requirements.
Two questions down here and then back there.
Dear Dr. Leigh, I am Druzienko Gennady. I am Woodrow Wilson Scholar from Ukraine. You mentioned some country which declared their willingness to join EU but haven't applied yet. Beyond doubts, Ukraine one of them. And to the best of my knowledge, some weeks ago, the head of the Ukrainian mission to the EU, Mr. Veselovsky, published the article when she suggested that once association agreement would be finalized, Ukraine should formally apply for the EU membership. Could you predict some possible response from the Brussels and from the Commissions? First of all, if Ukraine do so after president election, maybe next year. Thank you.
Well, I could just say that Ukraine is not within my bailiwick at the moment and decline to respond to the question, but allow me nonetheless to respond. The current enlargement agenda, as you know, covers the countries that I've mentioned. As far as Ukraine, Moldova, potentially Belarus, if it established a democratic form of government, as well as the countries in the Southern Caucasus, are covered by this new initiative that the EU has taken this year to develop an Eastern Partnership within the framework of our neighborhood policy. And I think that reflects the current consensus on the issue. And it's a very substantial commitment. The association agreement that is being negotiated with Ukraine, first of all, the fact that in the end the EU agreed to regard this as an association agreement, and the fact that when you look at the content, you can see that it is very, very wide-ranging. I mean, not only free trade, what was originally described as a deep free trade agreement, but a vast area of regulatory convergence, perhaps going beyond, in fact, the Europe agreements that there were with the countries in Central and Eastern Europe before they became members. This agreement still needs to be completed. And I think this agreement will create, so to speak, homework for quite some years ahead and could help guide Ukraine through further political and economic reforms. And I think the absolute priority at the moment in terms of EU-Ukraine relations is to complete these negotiations, to get this agreement signed and ratified, and for Ukraine to establish a track record demonstrating its willingness and capacity to implement the commitments coming from that agreement. And against that background, I think in the future we'll just have to see how the situation evolves. Under the EU treaties, any European country which shares the EU's values may apply for membership. I think it's very wise for countries to weigh very carefully the likely response before deciding to do that. And I think most potential candidates take extensive soundings with the existing member states to assess what the reaction might be before taking this important step. If the step is taken before consensus has emerged in that direction, it may lead to disenchantment on the side of public opinion and so on. So I would say at this stage we have created a very well-structured relationship which objectively moves Ukraine closer towards the European Union. And as to further steps, we'll just have to see what the mood is in Ukraine and in the European Union some way down the road.
I have 5 people who would like to ask questions, and I'm going to try and do it quickly. Barry.
Hi, I'm Barry Posen. I'm a fellow here this year. Normally I teach in the political science department at MIT, so I bring you greetings. I study international politics, particularly security politics, and among the people who write about that, it's kind of an old custom to make light of the European Union as a foreign policy actor and to minimize its ability to concert its actions, et cetera, et cetera. In light of the observation you made about CFSP and ESDP being part of the acquis, I wonder if you could just say a few words about what that means instrumentally and operationally in the life of the European Union, and what one should say to, say, people on the security side who look at the European Union and make light of it. I mean, how does that the fact of these things being in the acquis, how is it affecting EU policy now, and how is it likely to affect EU policy in the future?
very interesting question, which would require, I think, not just a session of an hour and a half, but perhaps several years. And I'm sure you're deeply engaged in looking at those issues.
I spent 1 year on it.
Okay, and you still have fundamental questions. I think the common foreign and security policy is a really important part of the way the European Union is developing. Common actions agreed by the member states in the framework of the CFSP have led to all kinds of missions, whether conflict prevention, whether border control missions such as the one between Moldova and Ukraine, peacekeeping actions, humanitarian actions around the world, as well as many common positions on foreign policy issues to which the candidates and potential candidates are invited to align themselves. It's still a work in progress. Even more so, the European security and defense policy, which is newer. The High Representative in Brussels, currently Mr. Solana, now has a military staff. We have a certain capacity to concert on military matters. There are a number of missions around the world flying EU flags. But clearly we're at the very early stage of the development of this policy. In a way, the name raises expectations that do not correspond with present realities. I mean, this is not a policy which deals with homeland defense, for example, or some of the fundamental security and defense issues that states are dealing with. The Lisbon Treaty, when ratified, will carry this process a very considerable way further on by consolidating and bringing together the different actors who are involved. It's an area where candidates and potential candidates are invited to demonstrate their willingness and their capacity to participate in the formulation of policy. And before they join, developing a track record of alignment with common positions is one of the considerations that we look at. So I think we would need much more time to go into this area in more detail. But when you look at the present and future development of the European Union, I think this is one of the main areas where we can expect to see progress. And I think for the transatlantic agenda as well, given that there has been a mood both in Washington and in Europe to explore areas where we could further develop our cooperation, I think this is one of the most promising areas. But I know it's a slightly inadequate answer to a very complex question. I hope we'd find an occasion to talk in more detail.
Do you have time for just a couple of more questions? The gentleman in the blue shirt, and then here, and then you two. Yeah.
Hello, Michael Marble. 2 questions for you. First of all, with regards, there's been some criticism that Bulgaria and Romania were exceeded too early. I was wondering, given your background in it, what type of lessons were learned from the accession, especially with regards to corruption and organized crimes? What type of analysis has gone on, and what type of implications does that have for the rest of the Western Balkans as they proceed forward on their path? And the second question I had to do with Lisbon. There's been a number of scenarios in which Lisbon may not end up being ratified. There are, of course, diverging views on this impact for future enlargement. I wanted to know if you could just talk briefly about the impact of what would happen if Lisbon did not end up being ratified.
Well, let me take the latter first. And you clearly do not expect a European public official to speculate about such an unthinkable development. So I will refrain from doing so. On your first question, I think the main lesson drawn from the experience with Bulgaria and Romania is that issues like the prevention of corruption and strenuous measures against organized crime, having in place an effective and independent judiciary, are issues that need to be tackled much earlier on in preparations for EU membership. In the case of Bulgaria and Romania, for example, we really only developed a process with peer reviews by lawyers, judges, magistrates, police officials from our existing member states working together with the authorities in Bulgaria and Romania at a very late stage, almost at the end of the accession negotiations. And this time we have drawn the lesson that these issues need to be tackled much earlier on. And, for example, with Croatia, that is well advanced in the accession negotiations, throughout the course of this year, we have had peer groups from our member states, magistrates, lawyers, police officials, visiting Croatia for extended periods, working together with them, sharing our own experience, and nudging them in the direction of the necessary reforms at a much earlier stage. So I think that would probably be the main lesson that we drew from the experience with Bulgaria and Romania.
Lady over here, and then
Dr.
over
Leigh,
here.
it's very nice to listen to you again. I had listened to you about a little more than a year ago at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul as a student of Dr. Kirişçi, and we had discussed this then, and you touched upon it just a little bit during your discussion. We look at the history of EU and EU being a sui generis supranational organization, and how much sovereignty do all these states want to give up? What are the discussions in relation to that? And I'm just curious, what do you personally think? How many more train wagons can the EU machine handle? Especially with relation to Turkey, it's always mentioned. I mean, this is all it can pull. It can't pull any more wagons. How many more train cars can EU mission handle? What do you personally think?
I think that things have worked out very differently from how some observers thought they would, let's say before enlargement occurred. This is a way of coming to an answer to your question. I think before the fifth enlargement, many felt that the EU institutions might grind to a halt, that decision-making would become impossible, that the sheer diversity of member states with going from 15 to 27 in a short period would mean that we simply would not be able to function or deliver in our main policy areas. And I think the main experience of the last 5 years has been that that has not occurred. And that despite these kind of fears, if you look at all the major policy areas of the EU, competition policy, I mean, certainly if you are one of the companies that have been subject, if you're Microsoft or I don't know whom, you have no doubts that EU competition policy is effective. You may not always agree with its conclusions, but it works. And if you look across the whole range of issues, functioning the internal market, the agriculture policy, you may like it, not like it, it works. Trade policy, where the EU has exclusive competence. True, the Doha round has not been concluded, but it's not for those reasons. So I think the main lesson that one has learned from the last 5 years' experience is that enlargement has not prevented the institutions from functioning. And that when you see cleavages among member states, they're just as likely to be among old member states than they are all the old member states aligned on one side, say, and the new member states aligned on the other. So I think, yes, table rounds in the Council of Ministers take longer. If 27 delegations need to intervene, that takes longer than 15. And in the European Commission, we have, for the moment, 27 commissioners. Under the Nice Treaty, it's due to go down to a fewer number. Under the Lisbon Treaty, that would happen only after 5 years. But still, broadly speaking, any observer at the EU, I think, would not doubt that the EU has continued to function effectively following enlargement. Nonetheless, it's been very clearly indicated that for us to be able to sustain this process in the future, the improvements provided by the Lisbon Treaty are really very important indeed, particularly steps such as the move to qualified majority voting as a normal decision rule, the co-decision position of the European Parliament, the new structures in foreign policy, and other such innovations. So before we could contemplate a further widening of the enlargement agenda, it's absolutely essential to consolidate what has been achieved until now, to further strengthen the institutions, which is the main goal of the Lisbon Treaty, and then to see where we stand. But as I answered the previous question, the EU treaty is clear about which countries potentially are eligible for EU membership.
The lady in black, and then the gentleman back there for the last question. I'm sorry.
Barda Azari, Voice of America. My first question will be with regard to Albania. Do you have a time frame with regard to the visa liberalization process when that might be approved? And the second thing is, does the EU fear growing skepticism among the public opinion in the countries that were left out from the visa liberalization process in terms of being told that they have a European perspective but not being allowed to see that future, basically? And also that there might be the possibility that the public opinion might think of a double standard being applied, of some countries being left out of the integration, and while Serbia is being fast-tracked into the EU, while it has not fulfilled all the conditions, like cooperation with The Hague or trying to undermine the EU mission in Kosovo. And the last point I would like to make...
That's 6 or 7 questions there. Go quick, please.
This is the last thing I wanted to ask, actually. What will the EU do to prevent a similar situation coming up between Serbia and Kosovo as it has happened between Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, and all that, in terms of vetoing an eventual membership? In terms of being able to veto an eventual membership for Kosovo and integration. Thank you.
Well, as you said, there's a huge raft of issues there. Just very, very quickly, visa liberalization. The Commission has said that provided they meet the very explicit benchmarks that have been set, it should be possible for us to go ahead with visa liberalization with Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina next year. I mean, any perceptions of discrimination are really beside the point when you see that we issued all the countries concerned with visa liberalization roadmaps with explicit reforms that were needed, mainly in the area of security of travel documents, biodata included in passports, stronger border management, and other such steps. And the fact that 3 countries had met those conditions and 2 others had not yet, where we expressed the hope that the 2 could do so with the necessary efforts by next year, I think is anything but discriminatory. On the contrary, there's a really clear set of benchmarks that need to be reached. In the case of Albania, I think that there's already been major progress towards addressing these benchmarks. In the context of the elections, a lot was done to issue new style identity documents, and we hope that if they continue working on border management and so on, they can make progress. In the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, there's also been progress, but the country is clearly held back in this and other areas by the difficulty it has in taking decisions because of the multi-level governance system and the blockages in that system. And I think it's really imperative in the period ahead that Bosnia-Herzegovina should take the steps satisfying the conditions that have been set for the withdrawal of the Office of the High Representative and also taking steps in the direction of constitutional reform so that the country's parliament and government can operate effectively. And if it succeeds in doing that, then I think that within a year or so we can also take that step regarding Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Gentleman in the back, quick question.
My name is Solon Sava. I'm the DCM of the Cyprus Embassy here in Washington, D.C. One quick comment and a question. The comment is in regards to the talk that was at the beginning of the Q&A session regarding the commitments of the EU towards the Turkish Cypriot community. Let me just be clear that there's no commitment by the EU on direct trade regulation. That's just a proposal that's coming from the Commission. The conclusions of 2004 talk about helping the Turkish Cypriot community with a view to reintegrating and reunifying the country, and our position on the direct trade regulation is very clear that that's not the purpose. In any case, the Cyprus problem with the accession process of Turkey are two separate issues which should not be linked. That this leads to my question. There's another report that is due to come out towards the end of the year, which is only in regards to Turkey, and it's Cyprus specific, and it's regarding the obligations that Turkey has vis-a-vis Cyprus, stemming from the 21st September 2005 statement of the EU for the additional protocol to the Ankara Agreement, which includes, besides ports, airports, it includes normalization of relations with the Republic of Cyprus. It includes the Turkey stopping the vetoes that it puts on various organizations that the Republic of Cyprus is trying to join. I was wondering if you have a comment on what the Commission is thinking about that report, which direction that might go. I know we have the negotiations, but just a quick comment on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, the report that we are going to issue next month will certainly deal with the question that you mentioned, and the Commission has undertaken to report each year on Turkey's compliance with its obligations under the additional protocol. And as we did last year, we will report factually on what has been achieved or not achieved, and we find that Turkey still has not fulfilled this obligation. And I think that will be fully reflected in our report. In other areas that you mentioned, we would like to see further progress. And, for example, when it comes to issues like the participation of Cypriots in initiatives under certain international bodies, such as the OECD, in fields of education, for example, we have constantly sought to make progress so that any obstacles to such participation should be overcome.
Thank you. One sentence.
Thank you so much. Tatiana Munteanu, Counselor of Republic of Moldova Embassy. Which are, in your opinion, the perspectives for the Republic of Moldova to initiate negotiations on the associate agreement with EU, having in mind the recently decision of our new chairman, parliamentary chairman, to withdraw the visa regime with Romania? I mean, because EU had conditioned the negotiations on this association agreement. Which are your opinion? Which are the prospects for Republic of Moldova to conclude this agreement?
I'm afraid I have to disappoint you in that I have not followed the situation recently in detail in Moldova. In my previous position, I was responsible for Moldova, but I'm not now. Therefore, I am familiar with the broad architecture of our policy, which is the one I mentioned, Eastern Partnership, association agreements, and so on. But I am afraid I'm not au courant with the latest developments. I'm sorry.
I have failed in my duty. I was to get you out of here at 11 o'clock, and I've gone 20 minutes over, and I apologize, but it was a great deal of interest. Michael, Dr. Leigh, we thank you very much. You're extraordinarily generous with your time.